Hi, we're going to talk about the Hungarian Major Scale today, based on the 12 keys. The formula is as follows. The half steps fall between the second and third step of the scale, fourth and the fifth step of the scale, sixth and seventh. This scale also has whole steps, but it has one whole and a half step between the first and the second step. Let's start with C. The formula says we need a whole and a half step, so C to D sharp. Okay. Okay. Formula says between the second and third step we need a half step, so D sharp, half step, B E. Okay. Formula says nothing about third to fourth, so it's going to be automatically a whole step. E to F sharp is a whole step.
Put the accidental higher on top of
The fourth to the fifth step calls for a half step. F sharp to G is a half step. Fifth to sixth, it's not written up here in the formula, so it must be a whole step. G to A is a whole step. Okay. Sixth to seventh step calls for a half step. A becomes A sharp. Seventh to the eighth step of the scale, formula says nothing about that, so it must be a whole step. Okay, A sharp to B sharp. There is no such thing as B sharp, so we call it a C. Okay, there's your Hungarian major scale. That's 3 sharps. Let's move on to the D, Hungarian major. Starting with D, that's the first. Formula says between first and second, you need a whole and a half step. So D to E, and then you sharp it. There is no E sharp, so it's called F inharmonically. Second and third step of the scale calls for a half step. F to F sharp, half step. Third and fourth of the scale must be a whole step. F sharp, G sharp. Fourth and fifth, formula says it's a half step. G sharp to A. Formula says between fifth and sixth, nothing there, so it must be a whole step. A to B is a whole step. Between the sixth and the seventh calls for a half step. B to C is a half step. Okay, 7 to 8 doesn't say anything up here, so it must be a whole step. Back to D. We have 2 sharps. Okay, let's move on to the E, Hungarian major scale. E is the first. Between the first and second, we need a whole and a half step. So E to F is only a half step. We need to make it a G for a whole and a half step to follow the formula. Second to third calls for a half step, becomes G sharp. Third to fourth doesn't say anything here, so it must be a whole step, becomes A sharp. Okay, between the fourth and fifth, it calls for a half step. That's going to be a B. Fifth to sixth step, doesn't say anything in the formula, must be a whole step. B to C is only a half step, so we make it a C sharp. Okay. 6th to 7th step of the scale calls for a half step. C sharp to D is a half step. Okay. 7th to 8th must be a whole step. D to E, that's a whole step. So there you've got 3 sharps in this one. Okay, moving on to the F, Hungarian major scale. Starting with F is our first. Between the first and second, we need a whole and a half step. So F to G is only a full step, so you need to sharp it, make it a whole and a half. Second and third step of the scale, the formula calls for half step. G sharp to A is a half step. Between the third and fourth, nothing here, so it must be a whole step. A to B is a full step. 4th to 5th, formula calls for a half step. So we can't really say B sharp. It's a C. It's the same note, but you call it by a C. Okay, between the 5th and the 6th scale, formula says nothing about that. It must be a whole step. So it's a D. Between the 6th and the 7th step calls for a half step. Okay, D sharp. And between the 7th and the 8th must be a full step. So D sharp to F is a full step. So there you have 2 sharps in there, and that's your F Hungarian major scale. Moving on to the G Hungarian major scale. G is the first. Formula says between 1 and 2 you want a whole and a half step. So G to A is a whole step. A sharp would be your whole and a half. Okay, between the 2nd and 3rd you only need a half step. So A sharp to B is a half step. Okay, formula says from the 3rd and 4th is a whole step. So B to C is only a half step, so you have to sharp it to make it the full step. Okay, 4th and 5th calls for a half step. 4 to 5th, C sharp to D, so that works. Here's your 5th to 6th step, requires a full step. So D to E. Okay, 6th to 7th requires a half step. So E, you don't really say E sharp, it becomes F. Okay, and between the 7th and 8th, formula says it's a whole step, so F to G. And there you have it, with 2 sharps in that one. Moving on to the A Hungarian major scale. The first step of the scale would be A. Formula says 1 and 2, you need a whole and a half step. A to B, and then you don't really say B sharp, so once again, it's a C. Okay, between the 2nd and 3rd step of the scale, formula says it's a half step, so C sharp. Between the 3rd and the 4th step, formula says it's a whole step, so C sharp to D sharp. Okay, the 4th step of the scale to the 5th requires a half step, so D sharp to E would be a half step. Okay, 5th and 6th, formula says it's a half step. E to F is only a half step, so you have to sharp it and make it a full step. Okay, 6th to 7th, formula asks for a half step. F sharp to G, it's a half step. 7 to 8, you need a whole step. G to A is a whole step. So there you have 3 sharps in this one. Okay, moving on to the B Hungarian major scale. First step is a B. Formula asks for a whole and a half step. Okay, B to C is only a half step, so C to D, it jumps all the way up to D for that. The 2nd and 3rd step of this, between the 2nd and 3rd step you need a half step, so D becomes D sharp. Okay, 3rd and 4th step of the scale requires a whole step, so D sharp to E sharp. You don't really say E sharp, it becomes F. It's the same note. Okay, the 4th and the 5th scale, 4th and the 5th step of the scale requires a half step. Okay, so F to F sharp here. From the 5th to the 6th, formula asks for a whole step. F sharp to G sharp, be a whole step. 6th to 7th requires a half step, so G sharp to A, be your half step. 7th to 8th step of the scale, again, you need a whole step, so A to B, formula works. You have 3 sharps in that one. And now back to C. Thank you for joining us today.